Really, I want to tell the story, one story, and I guess it'd be my version of that story of an effort to build support for rural organizing since the 2016 election, which has definitely been a job. So that's what I'm going to cover here. We'll get into some of the stuff around the fundamentals of organizing. I'm going to read a little bit because some of this stuff's too hard to remember, but I'll also break away from the script. I wasn't surprised Jeremiah was nervous. Seventh-generation resident of rural Haywood County, North Carolina, Jeremiah Janes had never spoke to 100 people, let alone 50,000. He had traveled from the hills of Appalachia to the front lawn of the White House to speak at a march to support migrant families. Resistance to Donald Trump's policy of separating families at the border had struck a nerve. I was nervous too. I arranged for Jeremiah, a member of the local community group Down Home, North Carolina, to be part of the program. And as we stood backstage, I asked him, I'm like, would you like to go over your lines again? He said, no, I feel fine. I'm prepared. The fact that he was shaking uncontrollably did not boost my confidence. His speech was yellow from sweat. So as it came time for him to come to the podium, I tried to work my way to the front of the stage through this group of 50,000 people. And as I squeezed through the crowd, I explained to people, I'm trying to get to the front to encourage my friend who's speaking next. And people were super kind, helped me through, some even pointing out better routes to get to the stage. As Jeremiah came out, he stood out. Here at an immigrants' rights rally was a white man with a baggy t-shirt, shorts. Wait, I should get Jeremiah. I got a picture of Jeremiah here. There's Jeremiah. White socks and tennis shoes. He was following Lin-Manuel Miranda, Alicia Keys, and America Ferrera. He started out quite hesitantly. My name is Jeremiah Janes, and I grew up on a small farm in Waynesville, North Carolina. We grew tobacco and raised chickens in the Appalachian Mountains. The crowd got silent. We moved around a lot as a child because it was hard to find a house we could afford. If we couldn't find a home to rent, we would just camp in the woods. When I was a kid, I didn't see the big picture. I used to see immigrants as nothing but a burden on the economy. I was sure it was us against them. And then somebody in the crowd yelled, "Why?" really loud. And my heart skipped. Jeremiah was the first speaker to acknowledge that his worldview on immigration was a work in progress. But he continued. But now I know that is just a big con. I want to speak to my community in small towns across the country. Migrant families, plain and simple, are just like ours. I know who is really hurting my community, and it isn't desperate families and toddlers in cages. I'm a seventh-generation resident of Haywood County, North Carolina, and I live right where I grew up. But my ancestors were migrants to the mountains all the same. And then it was as if 50,000 people exhaled inside all at once. As if everybody recognized this thing that seemed so out of reach in this moment was people broadening their view was actually happening right before their eyes. So in 3 minutes on a summer day in Washington, D.C., Jeremiah showed when it comes to waking, it's not where you start, it's where you end up that matters. Relieved, I worked my way back through the crowd, and people recognized me from when I came through. Oh, he did great. That was perfect. As I kept making my way to him, one couple came up to me and said, please tell your friend from a couple of small town people, he did us proud. We came all the way from Alabama. Feel so good about what he just said. We feel represented. Suddenly I realized tears were coming down my face, which is not a thing I do a lot of. And I think in part because I wanted this experience to go well for Jeremiah. And that did not seem certain as he went on stage. But also I was haunted by this question that the journalist Anand Giriharidas had posed about a year before. He'd asked, is there room among the woke for the still waking? I had really started to believe maybe the answer was no. But maybe there was, based on this experience. 18 months earlier, I was in a ballroom very different situation, speaking to a group of liberal donors and political operatives who were trying to make sense of something they couldn't fathom. Donald Trump was their president. And I was there to make the case for bringing the power of organizing to more low income and working class white people, including rural people, both as allies in the fight for racial justice, but also around their own interests and concerns. I knew this was going to be an uphill battle. For many liberals, Donald Trump's strong showing in rural communities was not a signal to fight harder for hearts and minds. It was more a signal to write people off and move on. In 2008, Barack Obama won 43% of the rural vote. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won in the low 30s. To win the presidency, Democrats don't have to win the rural vote and certainly aren't going to anytime soon, but they can't get crushed. And in 2016, they got crushed. So I made my case. And while I was not taken to task or booed off stage, it was clear from the reception that the progressive community was not prepared to have a conversation, certainly not a public one, about race, class, and who belongs in a new progressive coalition. So here we were, progressives, a group some would say maybe the most committed to becoming a more diverse, healed, and united America, unable to have this hard conversation. And if this group couldn't have the conversation, how was a divided country going to? But the gate, it didn't look good. I grew up in Southern, there's probably some slides here. That's good. That's where I'm from. Look good up there? Okay. I grew up in Southern Indiana, first in Seymour, which is the inspiration for John Mellencamp's small town. We called him Johnny Cougar. But then we moved, I guess that town wasn't small enough because we moved 5 miles outside of a town of 900 people called Medora, a deep, southern part of the state close to Louisville, and lived on 46 acres next to the area lumberjack Otis and his wife Flossie, and across the road from the county dump. Let's see here. We probably got another slide. That's the covered bridge in Medora. Like many Hoosiers, basketball was a big part of our life. Our goal was a piece of plywood on a telephone pole and a hoop out by the barn. And my brother and I, because it was out in the grass, we would spend hours trying to maybe get like a 3x5 spot that was flat enough where we'd kill the grass and have enough dirt that we could feel the sensation of what it might be like to dribble on hardwood. It was a pretty isolated country. We had to drive 40 miles to get to a town of 25,000 people, which we basically never did. So going to town meant heading to Brownstown, population 2,000. We would pack up a picnic basket, drive 10 miles through fields of corn and soy to get to the courthouse lawn and hang out with other families like ours. But for me and my brother, the draw was a World War II Sherman tank. And we would climb on it for hours. And we were really amazed that we lived in a place important enough to have its own tank. The last 30 years have been really rough on Medora, like many towns in the Midwest. We had a thing called the Medora Brick Factory. It was founded in 1904. Workers there knocked out 50,000 handmade bricks a day. And as kids, Spencer and I would watch the workers, and we're so proud that we were part of a town that made bricks that helped other people build their towns. In 1992, the plant was shut down, ending a 90-some-year run. And then a few years later, we had a plastics plant in the area that helped make Polaroid camera bodies. And for those who are maybe my age might remember Princess rotary phones. Folks tried to unionize, they busted the union, and they moved the jobs overseas. So we lost 200 more jobs. A lot of the meaning that was provided by those jobs has definitely been replaced, certainly in part by meth labs and opioid addiction, which are quite rough in the area. Scott County, which is one county to the south of where Medora is, made national news in 2015. 190 people in a 4,200 person town contracted HIV in a matter of months. 190 out of 4,200. And the reason was people were sharing needles while shooting a now outlawed opioid called Opana. Let's see if I'm missing any slides here. That's what the brick factory looks like today. People shooting up. So most Americans really weren't tracking these trends, ones that are certainly not unique to Indiana. That really changed when Donald Trump showed up on the scene and won the support of rural voters in 2016. And as he ascended to the presidency, rural people and rural voters, the people that supported him, climbed from the back page front and the top above the fold. The Wall Street Journal declared rural America the new inner city, which we could probably spend an hour of talking about everything that's wrong with that comment. And JD Vance's hillbilly elegy, went straight to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. So suddenly, people across the country who are not rural wanted to know, who are these rural white people with red hats, and why are they so attracted to Donald Trump? So the media interest was new, but the challenges were not. The decline of small towns and small cities throughout the Midwest and the Rust Belt had begun decades ago. And then on the political front, the right doubled down on the rural vote, and really largely the reaction of the left and the Democratic Party was retreat. So it's a week after Trump won the election. I'm driving to work. I was organizing in Chicago. My phone rings. It's Bridget Flaherty, an organizer I hadn't talked to for years. We had last worked together in the aftermath of the financial crisis. We actually quite proudly shut down a Bank of America shareholder meeting, and the CEO actually skirted out and hid behind the screen because we had taken over the meeting. We hadn't talked for a long time, but she was calling to tell me she was leaving New York to move to North Carolina to be close to her mom and to build an organization in rural areas and small towns in North Carolina. She wanted my support. 2 days later, I got a call from Kate Hess-Pace. Kate, I knew from Indiana. She's from Indiana. She'd moved to the Twin Cities, become a really great organizer. She too wanted to come home. She wanted to move back to Southern Indiana and organize in small towns there. A week later, I'm in an elevator, and some guy comes up to me and he says, I want to do rural organizing. I heard you can help. I'm trying to move back to Alabama from where I'm from. So this little mini migration of people who grew up in small towns or red states, gone off to college, moved to the big city, after Trump got elected, say, I got to go home and organize my people. And the organization I was directing at the time, People's Action, we became a home for people who wanted to do this work. So we decided to start with listening. And we had 10,000 conversations with people in rural communities where we only listened. And we asked 3 questions. What issues keep you up at night? What do you see as the solution to those issues? And finally, we asked people who do you see as responsible for the challenges in the community? The most pressing issues were, let me see if that's on this slide. No, it's not.
Ask about who's responsible, who caused it, or who's responsible for solving
Who caused it? Who did they think was responsible for it? And I think we said the declining conditions, because every county we picked had declining conditions. Great question. So I can go into much more detail on these answers, but I'll give you the headlines now. The most pressing issues were the lack of health care, lack of addiction and mental health treatment, and lack of clean water. In fact, because we did kind of word clouding around this, lack was the word that we heard the most. When asked what solutions would be most helpful, people said improving schools, more access to mental health and addiction treatment, and affordable health care. But things got really interesting when we asked the question of who and what is responsible for the hard times here. So familiar conservative scapegoats were definitely named. So 52% of people, some of these aren't going to line up with what I'm going to say, but 52% of people said folks that depend on government programs are responsible or partly responsible for our problems. 43% said immigrants were responsible or partly responsible. 81% of people said a government controlled by big money donors and corporate lobbyists were responsible. And 2/3 said Wall Street and big corporations were responsible. So there was much more support for what I would maybe call a kind of punch up populism than a punch down populism. We can debate whether the Democratic Party has done much to seize that, but that was what we found on the doors. But maybe most striking to us was the number of times people said to us, nobody's ever asked me before. We heard it over and over. We even named one of our reports, nobody's ever asked me before. People were moved by being asked. And it was a reminder, I think, of why listening, truly listening, is actually one of the most important political acts that we can take. So our organizing uncovered the issues that were most pressing for people. It was pretty simple for us. We did what good organizers do. We organize on those exact issues. I'm a believer that you organize on the most widely and deeply felt issues, and you will get a lot of people together. And then we won. We won campaigns on fracking, on opioid relief, on expanding Medicaid. In one county, we won what we're pretty sure is the first rural living wage ordinance in the country. It impacted a whopping 18 workers at the county in Appalachia, but we won and they got a big raise. But really, more importantly than the winning was people started having these beautiful, challenging, and cathartic conversations about race and racism, and got into conversations around how racism created different outcomes for different people, and how really racial division and racism was why we hadn't been in a room together winning in the first place. I don't want to act like they all went well. Some went quite horribly and blew up, and we had to clean them up or you know start a new group. But so many of them were highly effective. We felt like we were succeeding. Still, we kept running into one scenario: people who were very involved in the organizing, who were proud of their growing racial consciousness, would confide in an organizer that a liberal position on immigration was a bridge too far for them, and they couldn't come along on it. I really, this deck is new, so you guys are, I'm kind of learning. Oh yeah, there we go, more punch up. Yes. Um, so we decided we had to do something about this. We knew this was going to come to. This confirmed what many of us already knew from our experience as organizers, our experience growing up in small towns, that immigration would be used to divide working class people from one another for generations, and that we needed a plan. So 20% of voters are liberal on issues like expanding public health care, raising the minimum wage, and getting big money out of politics, but are conservative or nativist on immigration. And this group of people plays a big role in our politics, and especially how much people vote on this issue. And I would say on our politics and on our ability to solve climate change, to solve income inequality, and to address immigration itself. And it's a group very few organizations are focused on reaching. So we decided to see if these deep canvas conversations on immigration might help people re-examine their views. That's the work that Joel was talking about. The New Conversations Initiative, I think of as like the most effective and schooled and studied deep canvas organization in the country. And they describe deep canvassing as non-judgmentally inviting a voter to open up about real and conflicted feelings on an issue. And the model had powered the defeat of a 2012 Minnesota marriage amendment that would have outlawed gay marriage. People would say that is what put that issue over the edge. So we decided we'd have these conversations about immigration, doing deep canvassing in the North Carolina Piedmont, which is kind of former textile mill territory, small working class cities in Western Pennsylvania, and in more rural and small towns in Michigan. And we framed the conversations around undocumented people being able to access expanded public health care. And we did that in part because it's a pretty provocative ask. It's like, what's different to say, you think we should deport people or not? We're saying we're going to expand health care and we're going to make it available for people that don't have papers to be here. So I'm going to just kind of walk you through a deep canvas conversation here. And I think I will read it. We knock on a door, and if somebody opens it, we introduce ourselves, our organization really quickly. And then we say, we're out talking to people about healthcare. And we quickly ask a person, we say, we're talking about universal healthcare. And if they don't know what that means, we describe it. And we say, if you love universal healthcare, you're a 10. If you think it's the worst idea in the world, where would you rate yourself? And we got to do this really quick because at this point, people are already mad that they're talking to us. So we do that. And after they answer, let's say they say, I'm a 6 or I'm a 7. We ask them, well, like, why do you rate yourself there? And we give people a chance to talk. And if they give, let's say they give a 2 and they say, I hate the government, we do not push back on anything. We are curious. We don't act curious. We don't fake curious. We actually really listen to learn. And let me see where I'm at here. And then we share where you stand. I say, I'm a 10 on it. And let me tell you why. And I tell you why through a story. We don't use any facts. We don't use any figures. We're not trying to debate people. We never debate people. We have deep canvassers that do debate people. And we say, you should go get a different job. Like, cause you're not going to be, you're probably really good at something, but not canvassing. I'm being honest. So, and we don't hide where we stand on the issue. We tell we're a 10. We don't act like we're like a worker for the census and we don't have feelings about this issue. And then we tell them why we became a 10. And then we say, hey, there's also a conversation about who should be included in universal health care, with some saying undocumented people should also be included. Where would you stand on that? I mean, and as you might imagine, in the QA, I could tell you some great stories, from the doors, but maybe somebody who was 8 on universal health care would say, oh, I'm at 2 on it being available for undocumented people. And then we again ask, like, well, okay, tell me why do you rate yourself there? What What makes you feel that way? Again, no judgment. We completely suspend judgment in these conversations. We never push back. And that is part of what works. People are waiting for us to jump down their throat and debate them, and people start to melt and soften and have a conversation. And something really interesting happens at about this point. Somebody who's like still got the screen door shut, the door's barely open, often will by now walk out on the porch. And if they knew they were signing up for a 15-minute conversation when we knocked on the door, they would have never answered it. But something starts to happen and they soften. And then we share a story of how we became a 10 on the idea of inclusion, people being included on healthcare. And then we try to help them find a story, an immigration story in their life. That could be a family member, that could be a friend, it could be a coworker, it could be a neighbor. It might be from their ancestry. It takes different work for different people. And then we ask, when was a time that was really tough for you? And we're trying to connect that to the immigration journey. And I have never had somebody not tell me a time it's tough for them. And I'm remembering a door in rural North Carolina. The most traditionally masculine guy came to the door. I'd be a pretty scary looking dude, to be honest. Gun rack in the truck, unhappy that we were on his stoop. But when we asked him this question, he totally softened. And he said, a time for me is my son got hurt on the job. He worked for the sheriff's department. They fought his workman's comp. He couldn't work because he was so hurt. He had to move back into the trailer with us. He got addicted to pain pills. And I couldn't figure out how to get him unstuck. So we just took in that story and shared that sounds really rough. And then we briefly shared a story like this. And then we come back to the original question on where would you rate yourself on universal health care, and where would you rate yourself on undocumented people being included in universal health care? Some people don't move at all. Some people move a little, and a good number of people move a lot. I think I'm probably have a slide about this. Oh, these are people deep canvassing. So those are deep canvassers. I should tell you about canvassing with this group in Michigan. It was amazing. Some of these people.
Caitlin, yeah, that's
Right.
Yeah, no.
I wish I could say I put that slide in for you, but that is a coincidence. These are all deep canvas conversations. So David Brockman and Josh Kala are two of the leading academics on studying what helps change hearts and minds. Brockman's at UC Berkeley and Kala at Yale. And they measured and evaluated the program. And I can tell you more about how we did this later, but they determined here are a bunch of different deep canvas programs that they evaluated. They said that we had a significant shift on 8 out of every 100 people we talked to, shifted from not being supportive to being supportive to undocumented people being able to get public health care. And it lasted at least 4.5 months. That was the last point we had enough money for them to measure. So that's as far as we could measure out, which they said was a 20% increase in support for people being able to have public health care from one conversation with a perfect stranger on the doors. So pretty effective stuff. So on that day that Jeremiah spoke at the White House that I was telling you guys about at the beginning, something pretty profound happened. People in small towns across the country came out to support migrant families. People gathered in places like Martinsburg, Virginia, Muscatine, Iowa, even Antler, North Dakota, population 27. There were 750 rallies and marches on that day. Half of them happened in counties that went for Trump and were rural and inclusive of rural. And 130 of them happened in counties where Trump won by 60%. You would have predicted that actually the largest resistance to the Trump administration and then the largest outpouring in rural communities was on the issue of supporting migrant families. We hope this might flip the script on the story of viewing rural people as only one thing. I'll be honest, the only reason we know that is I spent a weekend tabulating it because the media never covered the story, which is really frustrating. But we thought this was a chance to tell a different story. Then in 2020, having done 4 years of serious rural organizing, spreading it out across the country, getting good at this deep canvassing, we wanted to see if deep canvassing could work in an election. And that had never been tried. It had only been tried on issues or on ballot measures. And we wanted to try it in a presidential election. So we were all excited. We started training. We started hiring canvassers. We started recruiting volunteers. And then COVID hit. And so this model that we built everything around which if it was anything, it was about face-to-face contact, was like the one thing we couldn't do. In fact, face-to-face contact is kind of the only thing organizers are all good at. So we were bummed. Uh, and so the big question for us is, could deep canvassing work on the phones? And it ended up it could. I think only in a pandemic, because we found the answer rates were super high. Um, and then the academics that studied said we've never seen phone answer rates like this. And the number of people that stayed through a 15-minute conversation with us on the election was also super high. In total, we had 280,000 of these deep canvas conversations on the phones across 7 states. And again, Brockman and Kala measured it. We got very into like, we didn't want to do this stuff just because it felt good. We needed to know it worked. And they found that this phone canvassing program was much more effective than political ads, than direct mailers, and traditional canvassing. They said it was 102 times more effective based on their studies, which I can't prove to you, but I could tell it worked. I left the organization that I did this work at, People's Action, a year later. I'd been the director for 14 years. I had been trying to leave for a long time. And so now I'm going to tell you about the next chapter. In early 2022, I got asked to join a Zoom meeting of rural Democratic county chairs from across the country. And the organization, Movement Labs, an organization, was providing support to these rural Democrats around the country. And then, oh boy, that is somebody that works with me. He didn't know how to get in. Okay. And as people gathered on the Zoom call, the call's facilitator was just doing a little small talk, asking people how they're doing. And one of the rural Democrats said, "Oh, our office got vandalized the other day." And the other rural Democrats looked pretty bored by this news. And then somebody else said, "Yeah, I got a threat the other day." And to be honest, they looked like it was like nothing more than the neighbor's dog had shit in their yard. It was like not a big deal. So the calls facilitator says, "Who here has received a threat because of your role in the Democratic Party?" Over half the group raised their hand. So I decided I get to find out who these people are and go meet them. So I decided to go out and meet with these rural Democratic county chairs from across the country. And I started here in your own state. I want to see if I have I got it right here. But on that call, people started sharing security strategies. They were like, okay, always have 2 big guys at an event, one in the front and one in the back. Call the town police and give them a heads up. But the sheriff's department is not going to be that welcoming. Never go canvassing with less than 4 people. But
Hey, George.
okay. So I felt like I needed to go meet these people. So I traveled to Algoma, Rhinelander, Elkhorn, Portage, Chippewa Falls, and Merrill. And I met the most amazing volunteers. They were fighting to keep local offices open. They were scraping money together for the occasional ad. They were running canvases, and they were raising hell to get yard signs out to rural areas. One Democrat I met with was spending down his entire life savings to keep the local office open. But there were also really hard things happening. In Algoma, I sat with 3 women who were knitting sweaters for less fortunate kids in other countries. And they shared with me how how QAnon members were being elected to local school, and far-right extremists were taking over county boards. And they said experience no longer mattered in terms of who was winning election, but they were still fighting and keeping at it. I drove around the state. I met with people some older women who had a former Dem turned Trump voter campaign. And so they would basically get coffee with somebody who used to be a Dem and had become a Trump voter once a week for months, just going like, maybe eventually, if we stay in relationship, they'll come back. In Portage, Wisconsin, they organized a September 11th event. They felt like they beat the right to patriotism for once like that. And then in Walworth County, people there were donating $30 a month to be able to keep the local office open. $30 a month, $360 a year to keep the office open. It was a super vibrant office. They had a bigger presence in their rural county than the Republican Party. And that was my last meeting, was in Walworth County. And I was proud of the what they were doing. They were proud of what they were doing in their vibrant office. And we sat down and I said, I got to ask, like, why do you guys stick with it? Like, you've just told me about the threats. You've told me about the vandalism. You just said you hadn't won a party, the Tea Party. That was 12 years ago. And the county chair at the time, the room got quiet. And I was like, well, maybe I was a little too blunt. Um, the county chair at the time, Ellen Holly, leaned in, looked him in the eyes, and she said, George, here's the thing. We get 40 or 50 more votes here, and other rural counties in Wisconsin do the same. We just might save democracy. And I drove home just kind of blown away, because the only story that we hear about rural is about MAGA supporters, is about hate and is about violence. Here were these folks that they were getting the hate and they were getting the violence. QAnon supporters weren't some faraway fascination. They were like their next door neighbor, their elected officials. They didn't have "Let's Go Brandon" posters weren't a notification they could turn off on their thing. These were their next door neighbors, and they were still at it. I would say they weren't even a footnote in the resistance to push back against Trump, though they should have been. Well, I'm going to get reorganized here. So I want to just talk about why I think there's been such a big disinvestment in rural voting and rural communities. And I think it's really driven by 4 misreads by many Democratic establishment leaders and donors and how they think about the rural vote. The first is just taking existing rural Democrats for granted. As I said earlier, in 2008, Barack Obama won 43% of the rural vote. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won just over 30%. In 2020, Joe Biden cut into that margin by a little over 1%, and then he pushed it up a little more in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, and he won the White House with those 3 states by 42,000 votes. So while the goal for Democrats should be to improve their showing in rural communities, actually simply holding the numbers that they have now, that's not a given. And unless Democrats truly try to contest for those votes, I don't think the party's hit rock bottom. If you take counties across the country that currently, let's say, vote 65% Republican, 35% Democrat, or 70-30, and they go to 80-20, it is game over in states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and so many more, and states that would soon join Iowa, Ohio, and Florida as one-time swing states that are now dependably red. A second common mistake is viewing rural America as white America. While rural communities on the whole are whiter than the nation as a whole, rural America is way more diverse than we realize. There's 100 counties in the country that are majority Black. Almost all of those are in the South and are inclusive of rural, if not very rural. And rural Black voters play a huge role in statewide elections throughout the South. And it's just one example. Raphael Warnock, the senator from Georgia, he won twice and would not have won without strong showing that he got from Black rural voters in the state of Georgia. And I think if North Carolina turns blue in this election, rural Black voters in the southern part of the state will have played a big role in that. More than half of the country's Native Americans live in rural communities. And in tight elections in a dozen states, the rural Native vote can tip the outcome. And the fastest growing ethnic group in America are rural Latinos, who really could play a defining role in so many states across the country. Millions of Latinos have moved to rural areas since 2000. And then a third common mistake is kind of a belief that rural white voters are immovable or only trending rightward. I knew that was going to happen. That's not true. The 2 groups that had the largest swing from 2016 to the 2018 midterms were single rural white women, a 17-point swing, and rural white voters age 18 to 29, a 16-point swing. So people are movable. And then finally, a false binary has emerged. This idea that persuasion is for white people and turnout and get out the vote work is for people of color. That idea got pummeled in 2020. Though Trump lost his campaign for re-election, his gains with Latino voters in Florida, Texas, and elsewhere totally turned heads and confirmed what many Latino leaders had been saying for years, that the Latino vote is not a monolith. Honestly, there were signs of this in 2016 as rural Latino counties in the Southwest moved rightward. in big ways that actually were eerily similar to what happened in the Midwest. The greatest concentration of Obama to Trump counties runs along the Mississippi River, starting in northern Illinois into eastern Iowa, Wisconsin, and up into Minnesota. And those shifts in rural majority counties in the Southwest, they weren't quite as big, but they were very similar. But to be honest, nobody wanted to talk about it. So who calls rural home is changing, and rural voters of every race are not static in who they will support and show up for to vote. Some move left, some move right, and some just check out. So here's some good news. Since that election in 2016 put a spotlight on rural, a ton has been built, like way more than I've shared today. I've just shared the kind of my vantage point on that story. First, because funding would be essential. A group of organizers and donors came together and created a thing called the Rural Democracy Initiative. Great organization, definitely worth looking up if this is of interest to you. And they raise money and do tons of funding to rural organizing groups all across the country and provide lots of other support. We would not be where we're at without them. And hundreds of new rural organizing groups popped up across the country, and some of them are really good and quite robust. I'm just going to name a few. Down Home, North Carolina, which came out of that phone call from Bridget Flaherty, and that's where Jeremiah James is from, the New Rural Project, and a group called Siembra, all three of those in North Carolina. There's a group called We the People in Michigan, Hoosier Action in my good state of Indiana, Hometown Action in Alabama. That was the guy that propositioned me on the elevator, Rural Arizona Engagement in Arizona. And here in Wisconsin, probably in the last 3 or 4 years, a group called Grow, Grassroots Organizing of Western Wisconsin, also a group to look up. But I could name so many more. So to keep this trend going, a team of organizers and I teamed up to create an organization called Addition. And Addition is focused on seeding new working class organizing to reach people that we think today's progressive community organizing sector is unlikely to reach. And the idea of the name Addition, and we're not really that into branding ourselves, is that we grow through addition, not through subtraction, like limiting who we're going to talk to, and we certainly grow through addition. And at Addition, we do 3 things. We basically incubate brand new working class organizing from scratch. We train people to do really good organizing, but to do it in a way that would be legible and make sense to people who are not already progressive. And then we tell the story of what's possible when we broaden who we engage, when we get people in the room together and make meaning together. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of that work, and then I'll wrap up and hopefully we'll have some questions. So we've incubated 3 projects in the last 2 years. The first, Bridget Flaherty, who founded Down Home, North Carolina, she had this theory she could organize working people through Reddit. I'd never been on Reddit. I didn't know what she meant by that, but she's a great organizer. So she came on and she did it. And she has built a huge base across the country of working class moms for whom the lack of support for childcare is the fundamental pain point. And that base includes, I would say, kind of center-right Republicans, independents, and liberal Democrats. And though they don't agree on everything, they just stay focused on this thing they can agree on. And they just do amazing work across the country. There's only 3 people on the staff, but they do so much stuff. Love to tell you more about it later. A second is called With Many Hands, which actually was also started with some of that Reddit work, but also used Instagram and Facebook. And they have built a base of Latino, Black, and white people in small conservative cities in New Mexico, in a part of the state that they call it Little Texas. It's like the most conservative part of New Mexico. And they started maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago. Now they're playing a pivotal role in one of the 24 most contested House races in the country. They had a candidate forum the other day. 200 people came. And these are 200 people that historically have had no interest in politics. So it's our whole thing. They're trying to reach new people. Great thing. They're on the front page all the time. Great organizing. But because we're in Wisconsin, I wanted to share a story from the Midwest and a story of one of our organizers, Mike McMahon, who's here and probably glad to have his name shouted out, and grew up, I think, in this town, if I remember right, had an instinct that one group of people that were not likely to be reached by today's organizing sector were small town seniors and people in rural areas, older people in the rural areas. So Mike began having conversations with people in the upper Midwest and doing a lot of listening. hoping to find out many things. But one of the things we always want to find out in organizing, what is the most widely and deeply felt issue? Because if you organize around the most widely and deeply felt issue, you will never say organizing is hard. People will get together. So Mike did that, and a super high percentage of people identified aging in a rural place as being really hard. I've done this kind of organizing, this listening for the most widely and deeply felt issue for 30 years. I've never had an organizer come back with such a high percentage as Mike did in these conversations. But there was special heat around one issue. Wisconsin now has 21 counties that own their own nursing homes. And at one point owned many more counties own those. And that's a thing that actually happens in a lot of states. Mike told me that's the same for my home state of Indiana. But there's been a push by conservative county boards to sell these nursing homes off, to privatize them, sometimes to shady buyers, and often for a song. There's good news. This issue has stirred up a hornet's nest. I mean, we've got older folks who are like flooding into county board meetings, marching in parades, and giving county leaders hell every step of the way. Some are even doing that with their very last breath, which we can talk about later. So this summer, there have been really big fights in St. Croix and Lincoln County and Portage County and Sauk County. I'd love to talk more about this, and maybe Mike will want to talk about it. Some of the best organizing I've been a part of in a long time. Training. We found that a generation of organizers had not been trained in the basics. And these are younger organizers that came up in a context of constant movement moments. Every election was the election of a lifetime. And really, there was no time to stop and train them in the fundamentals of the craft. And it really wasn't the fault of the young people. They just never got some of those basics. And it meant we had a field that didn't know how to do some of the organizing. So we launched a working class campaigns organizing training that we've run for tons of organizing, including lots of rural organizers. And then I'll come back to the deck. I'll explain why I ditched the deck later. But we also put a thing that Joel referenced, a little book out called The Fundamentals of Organizing. It lists 36 fundamentals of the craft. And I think Joel described it well. Very proud of that. And then storytelling. We think it's essential that we tell the story of organizing and that we tell the story of what's possible when we broaden who we engage. And we want to do it in a way that challenges stereotypes about people and places. As just one example, yesterday we released the second season of our podcast, To See Each Other, where we follow the fight of the small town seniors in Wisconsin I mentioned earlier. I'm going to pull back up the trailer and see if I can play it for you. So I'll just say this, like the last 8 years have been like pushing a boulder up the hill on the rural organizing front, but a lot of people across the country have stuck with it. There's enough of it to push it up the hill and to make the case for not writing people or places off. And while there's a long way to go, I think we're like on our way there. We're definitely in a better place than we were in 2016. And I would say 6 weeks ago, we got what I would call the biggest validation yet when Kamala Harris chose Tim Walz for running mate. She had her second event with Walz in a field surrounded by corn and soy. Everybody said it was in Eau Claire. I was there. It was outside of Eau Claire. And she was introduced by a family farmer. Axios reported yesterday that she's just did a big rural ad buy in Western Pennsylvania. I'm sure she'll do similar here. And so many Democratic Party establishment folks, honestly, even people who grew up in small towns, continue to write off rural areas and look down on rural voters. And I just love that it was a daughter of immigrants who spent most of her life in Oakland, California, who pushed back and gave the work to engage rural voters, really its biggest rubber stamp yet. So considering where we started, I really like where we're at today, and I like our chances. I appreciate you guys all being here, and I hope we have a little Q&A. Thank you.
There is a question from someone in the online chat. Casey Priest asks, what is the most important thing to remember when deep canvassing?
I mean, I think it's being curious, truly being curious about people, not faking curiosity, but kind of getting into a stance of curiosity, suspending judgment. I would say those are and then listening to learn versus listening to confirm. And I think in our culture, there's a bit about listening to confirm. I want to confirm all the ways you are who I thought you were, instead of a curiosity, like, what can I actually learn from this person? And I interviewed a guy named Steve Deline, who's like one of the premier deep canvassers. He's probably done 10,000 deep canvas conversations. He's who trained us. And I was like, how is having that many? And in a lot of the canvassing, he's gay. And a lot of the canvassing he's done has been to shift how people think about marriage, about gayness. And so a lot of, he's having conversations that involve his identity. And I said, well, how's this changed you? And he's like, now, no matter what somebody says, I actually recognize there is a logic to how they got it. I don't have to like it. I don't have to agree with it. I can find it hurtful, but I actually recognize there is a logic to how they got there. And maybe if I had the exact same life experiences, that might be where I am. So I think his, this isn't the question that was asked, but his faith in humanity is movable, and that it wasn't like people just came out of the womb just I'm just going to be hateful, So I would say curiosity, suspend judgment, listen to learn. Yeah.
Could I add something to that, George?
Yeah.
One thing when learning this process, I think writing it down is really important. The reflection of that is a really important skill. It's one of those fundamental pieces of doing this that I think is really important, that the reflection and that follow-up that comes after the visit, super important too.
Yeah. Great.
We have another question from online. June Zacconi, it's more of a statement, but she wants, she was surprised to hear you not utter a word about the issue of jobs or job loss in these specific communities. So if you could expand more on what sort of impact that has had on this landscape, and therefore the ways in which these communities that you're engaging and organizing within, how they're thinking about it, and what part does job loss have to play?
I mean, I can only say in the listening, I don't know why it didn't come up. The one thing I would say, I think healthcare is a big issue. We were doing a lot of those listening that I talked to you about during the time that the Republicans were trying to take down the ACA. So I think healthcare might have been a little more front of mind. I think in some of the communities I'm from, the job loss is so long ago. I don't think there's a lot of faith that it's coming back. Actually, if there's anything I hear is we actually have nothing. Like the town I'm from, the only thing that's left is a school. Every time I go back, there's something left. So they're we don't have much to go. So I don't know why people care about jobs. And there's a lot of good work happening on the rural front, but it's just not come up a ton in the listening that I've done.
Great, thank you.
I was wondering, when you were deep canvassing, especially around healthcare and the subject of immigration, if people question your definition of what healthcare means or what immigrant means, if you question them about what their definition of immigrant or healthcare is, and just the array of nuance therein, for instance, a Mexican immigrant versus someone from Greenland or Iceland.
Right. Oh, right.
And that's the first.
Yeah. Okay. I'll do that.
So much healthcare.
Right.
The healthcare, long-term care.
In that specific experiment, in which it was, the way we would do this is we would actually, and we took a long time to figure out with the academics how we were going to design it and study it. It was pretty rigorous. There were 3,000 conversations that were part of the experiment. The conversation was built around universal healthcare, which we would define. Yeah, it was around universal. So we could go do a deep canvas tomorrow on long-term care, but we needed to be specific, and we had a definition, I don't remember, that we would share with people. And then the only part of immigration we focused on was whether people were documented or not in that case. So we didn't get into would you feel differently if it was immigrants from Canada or Europe? We just focused on that thing. In part because we have to keep it so simple, because we've already are introducing a lot of complexity in those things. But yeah, but you could enter all of that into a deep canvas. People are now innovating and trying deep canvassing in all kinds of different ways and doing it on all kinds of issues.
The other question, you talked about some of the canvassers fighting to keep the office open. Which office? The office of their canvassing group?
That was the office of local Democratic county parties. Yeah, that was they were fighting to keep those open like that. Yeah. And just keep the money coming in. There was just no support. I should say, I meant to say this, and since I did that trip in 2022, and I think a lot of the folks I met with were pretty banged up still from 2016. And there was a big issue in 2016 of getting yard signs out to rural areas. I mean, I had actually almost could never get a seat in any of my meetings in Wisconsin before. I was actually starting, I was like, is there a rumor that I have a lot of power about yard signs? Because everybody was like coming hard on the yard sign thing. I went back and met with all of those folks just on the phone in the last few months. I don't even recognize them. One, the Wisconsin Democratic Party has gone big on rural. There are now 43 offices that the state party helps fund. They have a rural candidate support line. They do re-grants. They have come up with a better infrastructure to get yard signs out. So I meant to add that things are much better. And then the people I talked to, some of them I didn't even recognize. The women who were sewing the sweaters and really seemed pretty hit down. I talked to them the other day. They now supply signs and radio ads for 43 counties in the state. And they're now providing signs for other states. So they went from pretty hapless to they just took it under their own power. I mean, I was just like, this should be on the front page of the New York Times. It's an amazing story. So things have gotten a lot better here. This gentleman and then Tim and then
The first is just a practical question. So for us in Madison, how can we support these our peers in the rural Wisconsin?
yeah. I mean, I could tell you a few to keep an eye out for. I mean, if you're like, I mean, the folks in Walworth County, which is where Elkhorn is, I shouldn't be telling you guys are all from here, but like I'm there a lot. That is a really strong rural county party.
Yeah.
And like if people wanted to volunteer, if you emailed them, they will put you to work.
Okay.
So they are really organized. The other one that I mentioned that's improved so much is the Tri-County Influencer Campaign. I could give people the numbers. They're more up in the Algoma, kind of outside of Green Bay area there. Those are the key. And then the Wisconsin Dems do a lot. There's a group, People's Action, that I worked for a long time that does the deep canvassing. They are searching for deep canvas phone volunteers right now. So I could.
Wisconsin, what is it called?
Oh, it's People's Action.
People's Action.
Yeah, if you go to peoplesaction.org, it's up there, like how to volunteer. They need more. I mean, they're doing, I don't know, 5,000-10,000 calls a night, but they need more people to do that. So those would be some of the ones that come to mind.
So the other question is more theoretical. So the balkanization of the population along educational and class line, has that accelerated the migration of rural people from the Democratic Party towards the Republican Party?
I think we're seeing a shift that we might call it a shift of white. I hate the non-college educated distinction, but let's just say that, but it's one of the ways we say who's working class or not. I hate defining anybody by what they're not, but that's a thing we have a lot of data on. That migration of non-college educated white people from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party has been going on for a long time, steadily. And I think a miscalculation of Democrats who thought the rising American electorate of kind of voters of color, women, younger voters, thought that was going to work. What was not accounted for was a rapid jettison of non-college educated white voters to the Republican Party. But you're actually also seeing some of that particularly with non-college educated male Latino voters and some female voters and some with Black men. Jim Banks is a congressman from Fort Wayne, Indiana, from the state I'm from. He's running for the U.S. Senate right now. He wrote a paper to Kevin McCarthy when he was ahead of the House Majority Speaker of the House. And in it, he basically laid out a plan. Here's how we become the party of the working class. And he actually had a lot of data that showed there was just a decent number of working class professions that were way more likely to donate to Trump than to Biden. And a lot of Biden's donors were academics, worked on Wall Street, were white collar people. And so, I mean, that's one thing. But then he made a case of how double down on anti-immigrant sentiment, including being against legal immigration, go hard on kind of anti-China stuff, go against wokeism and feeling like there are enough socially conservative voters of color and Latino voters that wouldn't like that. And then act as if they were pro-labor, but be pro-worker and anti-corporate, but still pro-business. And he gave an example of Marco Rubio. with some great rhetoric standing behind Amazon workers, wasn't planning to do one hell of a thing for folks. But it was actually like, when I read it, I was like, this is a pretty good plan. Like this is, so I think it's something that's happening. There's a realignment around education and class happening. And I think we got to figure it out.
I've actually been listening,
Okay.
so I got to hear
Okay.
almost everything on my way here. So I'm curious, just trying to put together some of the internal understandings of sort of the psychological, sociological aspects of people. And I haven't read anything by you, and I haven't read the book, but I listened to in-depth interview with Arlie Hochschild on Stolen Pride. And then a totally different thing was just, I don't know, Dan Kaufman, who knows Wisconsin's recent New York Times Magazine article on NAFTA.
Oh yeah, I heard it.
To Milwaukee, and he just spoke here. And it was, so anyway, just trying to put some pieces together that kind of contradict it or aren't, how to put it all together. I feel more, I don't know, rings true with me more the emphasis you have and the emphasis Dan has than the stolen pride thing. I'm sure it's all parts of it. And one thing that sort of sticks for me is, I think it was in the interview with her, hearing about rural working class folks that were sort of liked Obama, but then at some point were like, wait, where did he get the money to go to Harvard? And like, why don't they ask that about JD Vance? It's really not where you get the money to go there, but what you do afterwards.
Right.
But just trying to put together the pieces of how people tick.
Yeah. Trying to think what the question is, but I think
Well, how do you put those together if
Yeah.
you do, or help
Yeah.
me think about it? Really,
right, and why some folks are kind of trending rightward is like overall.
well, it's a little bit of the question of, do you agree that this the stolen pride, shame pride thing is a really big central sort of enlightening issue about where people are forced into? Or I feel like your angle's a little different, and I would
Yeah.
love for you to clarify.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely don't think there's one answer to
Right.
what happened, especially in 2016 and what's happening. I wish there was, and it was that simple. But I know you're not asking that.
Yeah.
But a few things I think that have happened is I think people need to know who's responsible for their situation. You know what I mean? I think we have a natural instinct to know, like, who is the culprit here? Things are getting worse here. Who's responsible? And I think when we don't provide answers to that, and let's just say liberal or progressive leaning people, we've left a huge vacuum for somebody else to tell you who's responsible. And I think there have been many misses. I mean, I would say I do think partly because the Democratic Party has become a party of kind of establishment. It's very close with Wall Street. It's very close with Big Pharma. It's very even though it's more likely to regulate those things than the Republicans are, there is a closeness there and closeness with Silicon Valley that is hard for people to trust. I think there were major lost opportunities in the financial crisis. There has not been a moment in my lifetime like the financial crisis where you could have the overwhelming majority of people for a minute were like, it is the banks. Like everybody's like, it is the banks. Now, the meaning-making battle started. I think it was and I remember I organized 5,000 people to take over the American Bankers Convention in Chicago, put 10,000 people on Wall Street. You'd look up people of every race, of every age, of every class, really, coming out and protest. And then I remember, like in Chicago, one of our protests, I thought it might combust because people were like jumping up and down, but it was a beautiful multiracial group of America. And there was no question it was the banks. This is just one of my answers to you. I think it was a lost opportunity to say, yes, they are the culprit in this situation. And I think for many people in towns that have been declining for a long time, the financial crisis was like the last straw. There was something nagging at people that like, wait, this America is not producing the economy that I grew up in. It doesn't produce the same kind of jobs. The companies slipped down. So I think that left a huge opportunity for somebody like Trump to come in and tell a very different story. And I think that really started with the Tea Party. So I would say that's one thing. I would say, and the ability to stir up this anti-immigrant sentiment. And I think you're still seeing some of that now. There is a populism that's been brewing in America since the financial crisis. And I don't think the Democratic Party on the whole knows how to deal with that and wants it to go away. It would be railing against your friends. So I would just say with the one thing on that, I haven't read Arlie's new book. I just actually didn't even know about it. And I heard about it this week. But one thing I can relate to in that is like, so Medora, Indiana, which we talked about earlier, has been so hollowed out. There's nothing left. So I go back pretty regularly. There's been no new jobs. Every time I come back, there's something. You know, the cafe is closed. The gas station is closed. You know, everything's closed except somehow they've kept the school. There's only 72 kids go to the high school. Like, there's 18 kids in a graduating class. I don't know how they fought off school consolidation, but everything is closing. They hold an event every year, a dinner, raise some money to restore the covered bridge. It's the longest covered bridge in its kind in the country. People are proud of that. And they're trying to restore the brick factory. And failing miserable. I mean, they're raising just little bits of money. They're not. And I think it's just hard when the only thing you have to be proud of is the past.
Right.
So I do think that is a real thing. And I do think when the only thing you have to be proud of is the past, something like Make America Great Again, even if you took the racial undertones out of it, sounds pretty darn good. Yeah. And we'll just move our way back.
Yeah, you just got me reflecting and thinking about deep canvassing. Last initiative I was part of, it was a Narcanvas, we called it. We were handing out naloxone, Narcan, fentanyl strips in Macomb County in Michigan, the group. But that's an Obama to Trump working class place. And I was just reflecting on it. We would hand out the Narcan, the fentanyl strips, say, if you or a loved one been impacted, substance use or overdose, deep canvassing, open curiosity. But I think, we would come up against stigma of folks not wanting to self-identify. Some people will be like, oh, hell yeah, give me that, I'm a person in recovery. But a lot of people be like,
Sure,
why are you targeting me? A lot of people seem like confused. Like, what are y'all, social services? Why you doing this? But we're ultimately trying to walk a bridge to these ARPA dollars that are going to a jail rather than we knew the community was hit by substance use. I think my question for you is like, you got to keep the curiosity posture, but like, how do we do that without, making an ask or going back, or saying like, don't you know, like, can't you see your, do you know where I'm kind of headed with this?
Finish.
I guess my thought is you got the polls to show your efficacy of your deep canvassing, right? The research. And I think sometimes it could just hard to be extracted at work, or not in these deep. And I know it takes a long time, long-term investment. I guess it was maybe more of a reflection. I think, no, I think deep canvassing is the way to go, but our elections are only like measuring stick, like, did we pull a base off the doors?
Yeah. People are, in North Carolina, there's down home North Carolina's doing thousands of doors, and they pivoted the election, but we're doing deep canvassing on abortion in small towns and small cities. So you can apply it to anything. You can apply it. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. I agree. And I got 3 people here. Should I be?
Can we pivot to someone
Oh,
online?
yeah.
Yeah, that would be great.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone in the room. Liliana Barrera asks or writes, in your experience and observations, what role does someone like me, a Mexican woman advocating for the well-being of all children and families in this state, play in supporting rural organizing, especially when working with rural communities who are less welcoming to the conversation around race, reforming the vandalism in public building? I strongly agree with the phrase, we have more in common than we think. But do you have any guidance for Liliana or starting points as to where to begin?
Yeah. And what was the issue?
Fighting for, advocating for the well-being of all children and families. She works for an organization, Kids Forward, here in Wisconsin, that has formerly known as the Wisconsin Council for Children and Families.
I understand the question. I mean, and when is she hoping to get more people involved, or it sounds like, or
I think so. But I think from her perspective, as someone who is a non-white person in perhaps what will be more white spaces, what does it mean for her um, to engage in that way and to have conversations that do in fact center race? In your experience, what?
sure. Yeah, I got it. I got it. Well, one, I would just, and this isn't focused to her, but canvassing is not for everybody. You know what I mean? It's just, we just always say it's not for everybody. Not everybody wants to do it. Not everybody's, patient enough. Like I've been many times knocking on doors and you hear somebody across the street in a fight with somebody, you're like, that's not what we meant. So like, not for everybody. And it's not for everybody because you have to decide like what level of tension and how am I going to deal with if my identity is an issue in this? Like, so some people have to decide, is that something I want to do? So I'd say it's not for everybody and not everybody needs to do it. There's many roles to play in creating a better country. I will say in the immigration deep canvassing work that I've been a part of, many of the canvassers were immigrants or children of immigrants, and organizing in very white areas. And a lot of that took place in Michigan. Some of that took place here. So I think that's very doable. And actually those canvassers on immigration were more effective. They actually had a higher performance number because they were not telling some story of somebody they knew or something. They were telling a personal story about immigration. But again, if somebody's like, I don't feel safe, or I don't know if I could deal with that. Like, I think that's a decision that people have to make. And the same would be around kind of policing and mass incarceration. A lot of the canvassers who did that in the Twin Cities or around the ballot initiative were Black voters and formerly incarcerated. So it's something a lot of people do. And a lot of people will report being changed by it. They'll be like, oh, I had all of these like amazing conversations. Maybe the person said, hey, do you smoke? You're like, actually, I do smoke. And they sit down, they smoke a cigarette, they have a conversation. So, but really everybody has to make a call kind of whether to do it. And I just want to be sure this thing didn't get lost. It's like so many people in rural communities, very white rural communities, they're just great people. There are so many that fight for activism. I hope I made that clear with like, whether it's the Democrats, I told about the Families Belong Together, half of those marches happening in rural areas, similar stuff around Black Lives Matter after George Floyd was murdered. So, I just hope all the folks we're organizing around in these nursing home fights, like, are just great people. And like in Sauk County, I didn't get to read the whole article, but there was we're fighting to save a county-owned nursing home in Sauk County. And so, and had a board meeting that I think was pretty hard on the county board, as it should have been, because they deserve it. But they then the next month introduced some non-binding anti-refugee ordinance. It's just kind of a political ploy, I think. Like, and so like, but because we have folks there, our folks recognize that for what it was. So it just, I just don't want us thinking everybody in rural areas are problematic, which I don't think people are taking away.
I've got a couple more questions from online. So Leonardo Vasile asks, have you done organizing around food security and agriculture in relation to economic justice? And Casey Priest also thanks you for your previous answer and says one more question that might be more difficult to answer. How did society come to the divide of rural equals white and right and city equals Democrat and diverse?
You got a food story, Mike?
So I worked in ag and family farm agriculture for a long time. A lot of the things that we will see around corporate power and concentration, I would say, is accelerated in rural areas, particularly in agriculture. It is one of the most corporate consolidated industries. Cargill, out of Minneapolis, 1 in 4 grains in the world passes through Cargill's hands. So this fight and this work is, I think, in some ways accelerated in places, and it's about land. One of the big struggles of building a more just and more sustainable food system starts with the land. So we need to think about land reform in a way this country has not to this point. there is, of course, a deep history of racism that is embedded in American agriculture as well. Uh, that, of course, includes slavery, who can own land, and just accelerated forth. So there's another major hurdle that food reform and food sovereignty and justice in this country needs to contend with. There is, if you look more in a smaller scale or a little bit closer to home, the ability for people to organize in economic institutions where the returns of labor benefit the people who are doing the labor. Food co-ops, food aggregation, transportation, all of these things are now sort of part of what people who are engaging in agriculture movements are expected to do in sort of the local food movement. You got to do your own marketing, your own farming, your own transportation. So there is great passion and clear identified need around reforming our food and farming system, and lots of generated projects around that touch on all of those things in places across the country. We are looking at a need for a next generation of farmers as well. Average age of farmers in this country is probably pushing about 60 years old. And so when we think about, you may have heard about, there's a great wealth transition that's going to happen as the baby boomers pass on. There's also going to be another huge shift in land. And so when those shifts happen, things around consolidation can happen, or we can reimagine and rethink what is possible and what ways we can rethink about land, thinking about, and this again, it's an enormously complex issue in the United States. That thinks about indigenous people and land rights and all of that needs to be contended with. It's a long way to say, I think it starts with the land and builds from there.
Now, this is about Ireland, which is under. There's mass protest in Ireland, and the government frames it as these people who are considered. They deem them as right wing, as nativists. My question is this, right? We dismiss this notion. We say that these people live in a community and they share all these different qualities. And there's something essential about the community itself that they want to preserve. And when they see people coming in that don't share these qualities, either physical or non-physical, they regard it as a threat. Now, instead of dismissing these people and go, they're racist, they're classist, they're ethnocentric, we should take a step backwards and try to understand what exactly are they preserving? And is it legitimate that they preserve this essential quality of what they regard as a unified community? And that's really difficult.
Yeah. Okay, I don't know if there's a question, but
No.
okay.
But we tend to, the Irish government just paints these people as all like right-wing extremists, and they're not. Most of my family lives in Ireland, and they're not right. It's just that they've been hoisted with this responsibility. They had no part in the decision, and they just want to retain the sense of the small town they grew up with. They would prefer that it remain the same. Yeah.
Sorry, I missed you earlier. Yeah.
This will be the final question. So lucky
Great.
you.
Cool.
Yeah, so you kind of talked about like how you're organizing work, maybe informs this idea of like, hey, why are you writing off these areas of the country? So I guess what I'm asking is like, do you really think that the decision makers, so to speak, that are writing those people off, it's because they are not, they don't think that these are swing people? They think they're just like unswingable, and your deep canvassing shows like, hey, no, they're the same swing voters they were 8 years ago or 12 years ago. Is that, I guess that's how you feel about it, or is it like a different calculation of like, let's put the money into middle class suburbs, not
Yeah, I think on the like political donor establishment thing, it's like cost per vote. What's the cheapest way to get the votes we need? So, and then I think in that you lead to like a massive disinvestment. And let's say you decide you're basically not going to do anything in 60 counties in Wisconsin. But I think in that decision, there wasn't an understanding of like how low we could go. So I think I would say that is some of it. I think some of it is a discrimination towards rural and a looking down on rural I mean, a lot of this is very coastal, very, big money people. So I think there's some of that. I think it goes to the question earlier, which I didn't really get asked, is like, I think this notion of rural is one thing and it's white and it's conservative. So I think it's all of those in a misunderstanding, but it might at the end of the day for some come down to cost per vote. And and you're going to get some of that when basically all the people that are donating big money. I've always thought about what's the most effective way to make money and all of that, but I think kind of miscalculated. So that would be, I would say, one of the big ones. And then I think a lot of it's kind of almost foreign to philanthropy, like not even political philanthropy. It's rural's almost exotic, but in a bad way for some folks there. So we try to take donors out to rural communities and help people to see that. I did not answer this question somehow, but I just want to say it before we end it, is like this question of like, what do we do about the fact that like, how did it become that people view like cities or urban areas or people of color and rural areas are white people? Like, I don't know exactly how we got there, but we see it as one of the important challenges of narrative is actually tell a more accurate story of who is rural America and how it's changing, because it is definitely changing all the time.